What if everything you thought you knew about Noah's flood was incomplete? While Sunday school taught us about animals boarding two by two, there's an entire angelic drama unfolding in plain sight that most people don't know about. Genesis itself never names angels in the flood story, but later ancient writers like Enoch or Jubilees filled the silence with a cosmic angelic subplot. Today, we're diving into ancient texts, hidden scriptures, and biblical clues that reveal the cosmic role angels played during the most catastrophic event in human narrative history. So before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself, let us know where you're watching from, and what time it is. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The Cosmic Rebellion, the origin of the Watchers. Before the waters rose, before the ark was built, before Noah received his warning, there was a breach in heaven itself. The ancient texts speak of beings called Watchers. These were not ordinary messengers. They held a unique position among the heavenly host, assigned to observe humanity from a distance. Their name tells you their purpose. They were meant to watch, to witness, but never to intervene in the affairs of mortals. The Book of Enoch preserves their story with haunting detail. While Genesis offers only a few verses about the sons of God taking human wives, Enoch expands this into a cosmic drama that explains why the flood became necessary. The Watchers were created as guardians, set apart from humanity by design. They possessed knowledge of the heavens, understanding of creation's deeper workings, and awareness of mysteries meant only for divine beings. But watching wasn't enough for them. From their celestial vantage point, they observed the daughters of humanity. They saw beauty, desire, and a world they wanted to touch rather than merely witness. This longing grew within them until it became something more dangerous than simple admiration. It became obsession. The rebellion didn't happen by accident. Each of these beings understood the boundary they were about to cross. They knew the natural order placed them in one realm and humanity in another. They understood that their existence operated under different laws than mortal life, yet they chose to abandon their station, driven by desire that overruled their purpose. This wasn't the first rebellion in heaven. An earlier fall had already occurred, casting down those who opposed the Creator's authority directly. But the Watchers' transgression was different. They didn't seek to overthrow divine rule. They wanted to abandon it, to step down from their position and merge with humanity in ways never intended by creation's design. The corruption that followed their choice didn't spread slowly. When divine beings cross into the mortal realm, they bring their nature with them. The Watchers carried power, knowledge, and abilities that humanity wasn't ready to receive. Their very presence began to warp the natural order, like introducing fire into a forest. What started as desire became defilement, and defilement spread through the world like a stain that couldn't be washed away. The early chapters of Genesis mention that God looked upon the earth and saw that humanity's thoughts were only evil continually. But the text doesn't explain how this happened so quickly, how evil became so concentrated in so few generations after Adam. The Watcher narrative provides that explanation. Humanity didn't fall into this depravity on its own. It was taught, guided, and corrupted by beings who brought knowledge of sin from realms beyond mortal understanding. The world before this corruption was different. Violence existed, yes. Cain had already slain Abel. But there's a distinction between human sin and the systematic corruption that filled the earth by Noah's time. The Watchers introduced something foreign into creation, a hybrid evil born from the union of two realms never meant to merge. Ancient Jewish scholars understood this narrative as essential context for the flood. They saw Noah's generation not merely as wicked people who needed judgment, but as a corrupted creation that needed cleansing. The earth itself had become defiled, and only a complete reset could restore the original design. The Watchers' rebellion set in motion a chain of events that couldn't be reversed through ordinary means. Their choice created offspring that shouldn't exist, taught secrets that shouldn't be known, and introduced violence on a scale the young earth had never witnessed. By the time God decided to send the flood, the corruption had spread so deeply that only 8 human souls remained untainted. This is where the story truly begins. In a decision made in heaven, carried out on earth, That would require judgment through water and preservation through an ark. The Watchers didn't just sin, they broke creation itself, and breaking creation required unmaking it, at least for a time. The descent to Mount Hermon, the pact that doomed the world. Mount Hermon rises at the edge of ancient territories, where three valleys meet beneath snow-capped peaks. The mountain's name means forbidden place or devoted to destruction. Even before the Watchers gathered there, something about this location marked it as a threshold between realms. The Book of Enoch claims that 200 Watchers assembled on Hermon's summit. They didn't arrive impulsively or act on sudden desire. This was a planned conspiracy, organized and deliberate. They came together knowing full well what they intended to do. Their leader, Shemihaza, understood the weight of their decision. He knew that once they crossed this line, there would be no return to their former station. The texts suggest he initially hesitated, fearing he alone would bear the responsibility for such a cosmic crime. So he required something from his fellow conspirators, an oath, a binding pact that would make all of them equally guilty, equally committed. They swore together on Mount Hermon, calling down curses upon themselves if any wavered from their purpose. This wasn't a casual promise. They invoked binding oaths that would seal their fate regardless of the consequences. Each one agreed to descend, to take human wives, and to share with humanity the secrets of heaven. Among them stood Azazel, whose name would become synonymous with the scapegoat of later Hebrew ritual. While Shemihaza led in rank, Azazel drove the mission's darker purposes. He wasn't content merely to father children with human women. He wanted to fundamentally alter humanity's nature and knowledge. The list of names in Enoch reads like a roster of fallen princes. Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Chazakiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Batariel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapiel, Satariel, Turiel, Yomiel, Sariel. 20 leaders in total, each commanding 10 watchers, making 200 in all. Their oath complete, they descended. The Hebrew word used suggests a violent or forceful coming down, not a gentle arrival. They crashed into the mortal realm like stars falling from their courses. The barrier between heaven and earth, carefully maintained since creation, shattered at their touch. They took wives from among humanity. The text emphasizes that they chose these women, suggesting they selected specific individuals, perhaps for beauty, perhaps for bloodline, perhaps for other qualities. These weren't random unions. The Watchers had watched long enough to know exactly which humans they wanted. The women bore children, but these weren't ordinary offspring. From the moment of conception, something unnatural took root. The mothers carried giants in their wombs, beings too large, too strong, too fundamentally different from normal humans. Pregnancy became a burden beyond what mortal bodies were designed to endure. Meanwhile, the Watchers began teaching. Azazel showed humans how to forge weapons from metal. Before this, warfare involved stones and wooden clubs. Now swords emerged from fires, blades that could cleave bone and armor that could turn away strikes. Violence escalated from personal feuds to organized warfare. But weapons weren't the only knowledge shared. The Watchers taught enchantments, the cutting of roots for magic, astrology to divine the future, and the observation of celestial signs. Women learned cosmetics to enhance beauty beyond natural appearance, techniques to seduce and manipulate. Men learned metallurgy, not just for weapons, but for jewelry and adornment that fed vanity and pride. Each piece of forbidden knowledge carried consequences. Astrology led humanity to worship stars rather than the creator. Magic introduced forces into the world that humans couldn't control. Advanced warfare meant conflict on scales previously impossible. Cosmetics and enhancement fed obsessions with appearance and desire. The Pact on Mount Hermon didn't just introduce sin, it industrialized it, organized it, and gave it supernatural backing. Before the Watchers descended, humanity sinned through ignorance, weakness, and fallen nature inherited from Adam. After the descent, they sinned with knowledge, power, and demonic instruction. The mountain itself became a cursed site. Later texts would associate Hermon with demonic activity and pagan worship. The Canaanites who lived near it before the conquest practiced rituals there that horrified the ancient writers. Some traditions suggest the oath's power lingered on that peak, binding it to darkness long after the Watchers themselves were imprisoned. In swearing their oath together, the Watchers bound their fates. None could claim innocence. None could argue, they merely followed orders. They shared guilt equally, and they would share judgment equally. Their pact didn't just doom themselves, it doomed the world they corrupted, making the flood not a choice but a necessity. Forbidden knowledge and cosmic corruption, the gifts of Azazel. Azazel's teachings transformed human civilization in ways that looked like progress, but functioned as poison. Before the Watchers descended, humans worked with stone, wood, and bone. They hunted with spears, fought with clubs, and built with their hands. Their technology grew slowly, naturally, as each generation learned from the previous one. This was the intended pace of human development, matched to their wisdom and moral capacity. Azazel changed everything. He taught the secrets of metallurgy, showing how ore could be smelted from rock and shaped into tools that cut deeper and held an edge longer than anything humans had known. The forge became humanity's new altar, and metal its new god. The first weapons emerged from these fires: swords that could pierce armor, spears with metal tips that flew straight and struck hard, shields that could turn away the heaviest blows, armor that made warriors nearly invincible. Suddenly, combat wasn't about strength or skill. It was about equipment, about who had the better weapons. This knowledge spread rapidly. Each tribe that learned metalworking gained advantage over its neighbors. Those neighbors either learned the craft themselves or fell to those who had. An arms race began, driven by survival. Villages became fortresses. Farmers became soldiers. Conflicts that once ended in a few casualties now resulted in wholesale slaughter. But Azazel taught more than warfare. He showed women the art of enhancement, how to grind minerals into cosmetics that painted their faces with unnatural beauty, eyeshadow to darken and enlarge the eyes, rouge to redden cheeks, kohl to outline features. These weren't simple decorations. They were tools of seduction designed to inflame desire beyond natural attraction. The text specifically mentions precious stones and their use in adornment. Before this, beauty came from health, character, and natural features. Now it could be manufactured, purchased, and displayed. Competition arose among women not for virtue but for appearance. Men began valuing surface over substance, choosing wives for their painted faces rather than their character. Other watchers taught different secrets. Arakiel revealed the signs of the earth, how to read omens from natural phenomena. Asphodel taught the course of the moon, giving humans power to track cycles and predict events. Barakiel taught astrology, the art of reading destiny in the stars. Tamiel taught celestial signs. Akibil taught portents. Each of these arts pulled human attention away from the creator and toward creation itself. Rather than trusting divine providence, people sought to control their fate through magic and divination. Rather than walking by faith, they tried to chart their course by stars and omens. Shemihaza, the chief of the Watchers, taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. This was sorcery in its rawest form, using natural materials mixed with forbidden knowledge to produce effects that bent reality. Herbs that should heal were twisted into poisons. Roots that should nourish became components in curses. Plants became weapons as dangerous as metal swords. The knowledge spread like disease. Each person who learned passed it to others. Each innovation built on the previous one. Metalworking became more sophisticated. Weapons grew deadlier. Magic became more powerful. Cosmetics became more elaborate. Within a generation, human society had transformed beyond recognition. Violence filled the earth. The Hebrew word used in Genesis is Hamas, which means not just personal conflict, but systematic oppression and injustice. The strong dominated the weak with weapons the weak couldn't forge. Those with magical knowledge controlled those without it. Those who read the stars claimed authority over those who couldn't. The Watchers' gifts created hierarchy based on forbidden knowledge. A new ruling class emerged, those who possessed secrets others didn't. They used this advantage to accumulate wealth, power, and status. They became oppressors, and their victims had no recourse because the knowledge gap couldn't be bridged through natural means. The earth itself began to protest. Enoch describes it crying out under the weight of corruption. Blood soaked the ground from endless warfare. Unnatural practices polluted the land. The Nephilim offspring of the Watchers consumed resources at rates humanity couldn't sustain. Forests fell. Game animals disappeared. Fields failed under the demands placed on them. What Azazel and his companions called gifts were actually curses wrapped in appealing packages. Each piece of knowledge promised power but delivered bondage. Each technique offered advancement but produced degradation. Humanity accelerated toward destruction, powered by wisdom it wasn't ready to handle. The tragedy wasn't just that humans learned these things, it was that they couldn't unlearn them. Once metallurgy was known, it couldn't be forgotten. Once magic was practiced, it couldn't be abandoned. Once warfare reached a certain scale, it couldn't be reduced. The Watchers had accelerated human development past the point where wisdom could restrain knowledge, creating a civilization sophisticated in craft but primitive in morality. By the time God looked down and saw the extent of corruption, humanity had become something he never intended. They weren't simply sinful. They were armed, enhanced, magical, and violent in ways that threatened to make their evil permanent. The gifts of Azazel hadn't elevated humanity. They'd weaponized its worst instincts and given them tools to perpetuate themselves indefinitely. The Nephilim, the hybrid progeny and the giants in the land, the offspring born from the union of Watchers and human women, were wrong from their first breath. Genesis calls them Nephilim, a word that means fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. The Book of Enoch provides more detail. These weren't merely large humans or exceptionally strong men. They were hybrids, creatures that combined divine and mortal nature in ways creation never intended. The texts describe them as giants, not metaphorical giants of achievement or influence, but literal beings of enormous stature. Some traditions claim they reached 300 cubits in height, far beyond anything claimed in Enoch itself, so this may be symbolic rather than literal. What remains consistent across sources is that their size dwarfed ordinary humans, making them objects of terror to all who encountered them. From infancy, they consumed resources at alarming rates. A Nephilim child ate as much as several human adults. Their growth was rapid and uncontrolled. Within years, they reached full size and strength. Their appetites matched their stature, demanding constant feeding that strained the resources of entire communities. When local food sources couldn't satisfy them, they turned to animals. The texts describe them devouring livestock, wild game, fish from the rivers, and birds from the air. They consumed species faster than populations could replenish. Whole regions became barren as the Nephilim ate through every available food source. Then they turned to humans. The Book of Enoch states this plainly. When other food ran out, the Nephilim began consuming people. They became cannibals, predators who hunted humanity itself. Villages lived in terror, never knowing when one of these giants might arrive, demanding tribute or simply taking victims. Their strength was supernatural. One Nephilim could overpower dozens of ordinary men. Weapons that would fell a human warrior barely scratched them. Their skin was tough, their bones dense, their resilience far beyond mortal limits. Fighting them was futile. Communities could only flee or submit. But the Nephilim weren't just physically powerful. They inherited aspects of their father's nature. They possessed knowledge ordinary humans lacked. Some could perform magic. Others understood secrets of the earth and sky. This made them not just dangerous, but nearly invincible, combining physical might with supernatural insight. They became warriors and kings. Humans who couldn't resist them began serving them. Some Nephilim gathered followers, building kingdoms where they ruled as tyrants. Others remained nomadic, traveling from place to place and taking what they wanted. All of them spread violence wherever they went. The phrase, mighty men of old, men of renown from Genesis, takes on darker meaning in this context. These weren't heroes to be celebrated. They were warlords whose reputations were built on oppression and slaughter. Their renown came from fear. People told stories about them not to honor them, but to warn others. Some texts suggest they warred among themselves. When Nephilim met Nephilim, neither would yield. Battles between these giants devastated entire regions. Ordinary humans became collateral damage, crushed beneath the feet of beings fighting over territory or resources. Their very existence violated natural law. They were beings that shouldn't be possible, combining substances never meant to mix. Their birth was an abomination. Their life was a curse. Their presence corrupted the earth simply by walking on it. The bloodshed they caused made the ground cry out. Every victim's blood soaked into soil that remembered, that protested against the violence done upon it. The earth groaned under the weight of unnatural beings whose feet pressed too heavily, whose appetites consumed too much, whose violence spilled too much blood. Meanwhile, the watchers looked on, watching the destruction their offspring caused. Some texts suggest they tried to control their children, but couldn't. The Nephilim had inherited angelic power without angelic restraint. They possessed divine strength without divine wisdom. They were mistakes that couldn't be corrected, abominations that couldn't be reformed. Human women who bore these children faced impossible situations. Pregnancy with a Nephilim was dangerous, often fatal. The child grew too large, too strong, moving in the womb with force that damaged internal organs. Birth itself was traumatic, delivering offspring already too big for mortal bodies to safely expel. Those mothers who survived often died soon after, their bodies broken by what they'd carried. Those who lived longer faced the horror of watching their children grow into monsters. Maternal love warred with survival instinct as Nephilim children matured into beings their mothers feared. The Nephilim had no place in creation's order. They weren't fully divine, so heaven rejected them. They weren't fully human, so earth couldn't sustain them. They existed in a terrible middle space, belonging nowhere, accepted by nothing, tolerated only because no one could stop them. By Noah's time, these hybrids had multiplied. The original 200 Watchers had produced countless offspring, and those offspring had bred with humans in turn. The corruption spread through bloodlines, creating a population where divine DNA mixed with human in countless combinations. Pure human lineage became rare, preserved in only a few family lines. This was why the flood became necessary. The Nephilim couldn't be allowed to continue. They would consume everything, destroy everything, and leave nothing for genuine humanity to inherit. Their existence was the end of creation's purpose, a dead-end branch that would strangle the tree if not cut away. The cries of the earth, heaven's response to the defilement. The earth began to speak, not with words, but with something deeper. A groan that rose from the ground itself, carrying the weight of every wrong done upon it. Blood has a voice. Abel's blood cried out when Cain spilled it on the ground. But the blood spilled in Noah's time wasn't one man's. It was thousands, tens of thousands, accumulating until the earth couldn't absorb it anymore. The soil rejected it, sending the cry upward toward heaven. The Book of Enoch describes this as a collective prayer. The blood of victims, the tears of the oppressed, the suffering of the weak, all merged into one desperate plea for justice. The earth itself joined this prayer, its voice rising above the violence that filled its surface. In heaven, the archangels heard. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel stood before the throne and received the cry like a physical blow. They saw what was happening below. They witnessed the corruption that filled every corner of the earth. They understood that creation was consuming itself, driven by beings that should never have existed. The texts describe their response with striking emotion. These were not distant, cold beings merely following orders. They felt the suffering, they saw the injustice, they understood that intervention was required. Michael, the great prince, observed the warfare consuming humanity. Men died by the thousands in conflicts driven by Watcher-taught metallurgy and tactics. Families were destroyed, children were orphaned, communities disappeared. The violence wasn't random or natural. It was systematic and taught, spreading like fire through dry grass. Gabriel watched the sexual corruption. The unions between Watchers and humans weren't love matches. They were predatory relationships where beings of superior power exploited those with none. The women involved often had no choice. Their children were abominations they never asked for. The natural order of family had been shattered. Raphael witnessed the corruption of knowledge, magic that manipulated reality, divination that claimed to predict the future, sorcery that bound spirits and commanded demons. These weren't natural human developments. They were secrets stolen from heaven and forced upon a people unprepared to handle them responsibly. Uriel observed the corruption of the earth itself. The land produced thorns where crops should grow. Waters ran red with blood. Forests fell under demand for resources. Animals went extinct under the Nephilim appetite. The whole creation groaned under weight. It was never designed to carry. The four archangels approached the throne. They presented the evidence of earth's defilement. They spoke for those who couldn't speak, carrying the cry of victims to the only one who could answer it. The response came swiftly. Judgment was declared. The watchers would be bound. The Nephilim would be destroyed. The earth would be cleansed through water. Only a remnant would survive, one family whose bloodline remained pure, whose genetic heritage wasn't corrupted by the Watcher's transgression. But before the flood came, the archangels received specific assignments. This wasn't just about drowning the wicked. It was about dismantling a supernatural conspiracy, imprisoning immortal criminals, and preventing future corruption. The judgment required surgical precision, not just overwhelming force. The text emphasizes that God heard. This phrase appears repeatedly in Scripture when divine intervention follows human suffering. God heard the cry of the slaves in Egypt. God heard the prayer of Hannah. God heard the victims of Sodom. And God heard the cry rising from the corrupted earth. This hearing wasn't passive awareness. It demanded action. The Hebrew concept of hearing includes responding. When God hears, he moves. When he acknowledges suffering, he addresses it. The cries reaching heaven guaranteed judgment would follow. The archangels understood their role as executors of divine justice. They weren't vengeance-driven. They were instruments of a necessary correction. The earth needed healing, and healing required removing the infection. The Watchers were that infection. The Nephilim were its symptom. The flood would be the cure. Enoch himself, the seventh from Adam, played a role in this celestial court. He walked with God and was taken up to witness these proceedings. He saw the judgment declared. He heard the sentence pronounced. He carried messages between heaven and earth, delivering warnings that no one except Noah would heed. The condemned watchers pleaded for mercy. They asked Enoch to intercede, to present their case before the throne, but their petition was rejected. They'd known the consequences when they swore their oath on Mount Hermon. They'd chosen corruption with full awareness. Mercy was reserved for the innocent, not for those who'd systematically destroyed innocence in others. The earth's cry received an answer. That answer would come in the form of rain falling for 40 days and nights, waters rising from deep beneath the ground, and an ark carrying 8 souls through the judgment. Before the first drop fell, the heavenly host was already in motion, preparing to execute the sentence that would remake the world. The divine verdict. The archangel's mission of judgment. The assignments came down from the throne with precise clarity. Each archangel received specific instructions for specific targets. This judgment would be thorough, leaving no aspect of the corruption unaddressed. Raphael received the first command. Go to Azazel and bind him. Take the ringleader of rebellion and cast him into darkness. The location specified was the desert of Dudale, a place of desolation and emptiness. There, Raphael was to dig deep into the earth and create a pit surrounded by sharp stones. The binding wasn't gentle. Azazel was to be thrown into this pit with rough, jagged rocks surrounding him. Complete darkness would cover him. He would remain there, sealed away unto great judgment. This wasn't merely imprisonment. It was isolation from everything, consignment to a place where even light couldn't reach. The purpose of Azazel's binding went beyond punishment for his own deeds. Upon him was placed the responsibility for all the violence his teachings had produced. Every weapon forged using his knowledge, every battle fought with his tactics, every death caused by his metallurgy was charged to his account. The weight of his guilt would press down on him in that darkness until the final reckoning. Gabriel received different orders. He was to stir up the Nephilim against each other. The giants who terrorized humanity would turn their violence on themselves, father against son, brother against brother. The text suggests this happened through manipulation of their natural aggression. These beings who loved warfare would receive warfare as their judgment. The destruction would be mutual and complete. The Nephilim wouldn't survive to see the flood. Their own strength would be their doom, turned inward in conflicts that would eliminate them before the waters rose. This ensured that even if some humans survived outside the ark, they wouldn't carry Nephilim genetics forward. Michael, the great prince and warrior of heaven, received the most difficult assignment. He was to bind Shemihaza and his associates. These were the leaders, the original 200 who'd sworn the oath on Mount Hermon. They weren't to be scattered or destroyed immediately. They were to be imprisoned in a specific location, bound and held until the final judgment. The prison was beneath the earth, in valleys of the ground. The text describes hills and stones, but these aren't surface features. They're geographical markers in the underworld, the deep places where fallen angels await their ultimate fate. There, in complete darkness, they would remain for 70 generations. This time frame is significant. 70 generations would carry humanity forward to the time of final judgment. The Watchers would remain conscious, aware, suffering in their confinement while knowing the world they'd corrupted was cleansed and rebuilt without them. Their influence would be removed, their direct presence is eliminated, their connection to the earth severed. Uriel's role was different. He was assigned to warn Noah. Go to the son of Lamech, the man who'd remained righteous despite surrounding corruption. Tell him what's coming. Instruct him to hide himself. Reveal that the whole earth will be destroyed through water because of what the Watchers have done. This warning gave Noah time to prepare. He would build the ark over many years, gathering animals, storing food, and weathering the mockery of neighbors who saw no sign of coming judgment. Uriel's message made Noah not just a survivor, but a participant in the preservation plan, actively working to ensure humanity's continuance. The text emphasizes that judgment on the Watchers was irrevocable. They'd committed sins too fundamental to forgive. They'd crossed boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd corrupted creation in ways that required their complete removal from influence. No appeal would be heard. No mercy would be extended. Their fate was sealed the moment they swore their oath on Mount Hermon. Different fates for different leaders reflected their different crimes. Azazel, who'd taught weapons and warfare, received the harshest immediate imprisonment. Shemihaza, who'd led the initial rebellion but hadn't pushed the violent knowledge as far, received binding with eventual judgment. Others received variations based on their specific corruptions. The archangels moved swiftly to execute these orders. Raphael descended to Dudael and bound Azazel in the earth. The texts describe the demon's screams as he was cast down, his protests that he'd only given humans what they wanted, his claims that he was blameless because humans chose to use his knowledge for evil. None of it mattered. Into the pit he went, and rough stones sealed him in darkness. Gabriel moved among the Nephilim, whispering suspicions, inflaming existing tensions, turning their natural violence inward. Giants who'd fought side by side turned on each other. Sons rose against fathers. Alliances shattered. The beings who terrorized humanity began consuming themselves in civil wars that left none standing. Michael descended to the earth with chains that could bind immortal beings. One by one, he gathered the Watcher leaders. They tried to resist, but an archangel's authority exceeds a fallen Watcher's power. Each was taken, bound, and cast into the prepared prison beneath the earth. Their pleading turned to cursing as darkness closed over them. Uriel approached Noah with the warning that would change everything. He revealed not just that judgment was coming, but why. He explained the cosmic conspiracy, the corruption of bloodlines, the necessity of preservation. Noah understood that he wasn't just surviving a natural disaster. He was preserving creation itself, carrying forward the uncorrupted genetic line that would repopulate the earth. The angel's work was precise because it had to be. This wasn't random destruction. It was surgical removal of a cancer that threatened to consume the entire body. Each element of corruption received specific attention. Each guilty party received appropriate judgment. Each victim received acknowledgement through the thoroughness of the response. By the time the first raindrops fell, the supernatural corruption was already addressed. The Watchers were bound. The Nephilim were destroying themselves. The knowledge they'd taught would die with the generation that possessed it. The flood would complete the cleansing, but the angels had already removed the root of the problem. Noah, the righteous seed, a man preserved from the corruption. In a world drowning in corruption, one man stood apart. The book of Genesis tells us Noah was righteous, blameless among the people of his time. But the ancient texts reveal something deeper. Something that explains why this one man mattered so much. The Hebrew word used to describe Noah is tamim, blameless, perfect, complete. At first glance, this seems to praise his moral character, yet the same word appears elsewhere in Scripture to describe unblemished sacrificial animals, pure bloodlines, genetic integrity. Noah walked with God in a world where others had abandoned that path. But more than his spiritual devotion, Noah carried something precious in his veins. His family line remained untouched by the union between the Watchers and humanity. The Book of Enoch describes how the corruption spread through the earth like a contagion. The Watchers had taken wives from the daughters of men. Their offspring, the Nephilim, had filled the land with violence. But this mixing went beyond simple intermarriage. The divine and human had merged in ways that violated the boundaries of creation itself. Generation after generation, the hybrid bloodlines multiplied. Families bore children who carried the mark of this cosmic rebellion. The image of God, once clear in humanity, became distorted, twisted. The world God had made was being unmade from within. Yet in Noah's genealogy, something remained intact. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes this preservation. Noah's ancestors had guarded their lineage carefully. They had not joined in the madness that consumed the world around them. They maintained the boundary between human and divine that the Watchers had shattered. This purity made Noah the perfect vessel for a new beginning. He represented the last connection to the original creation, the last branch of humanity that remained fully human. If the flood was to serve its purpose, someone had to survive who carried the uncorrupted seed of Adam. God's command to Noah carried profound weight. Build an ark. Gather your family. Bring pairs of every living creature. This was not just rescue. This was preservation of the original design. The animals, too, needed protection from the corruption that had spread. Some ancient texts suggest even the natural world had been defiled by the Watchers' influence. Creatures had been mixed and altered. The boundaries between species had been violated just as the boundary between divine and human had been crossed. Noah became the keeper of creation's purity. Every creature that entered the ark represented an unblemished line. Every species preserved was a rejection of the chaos the Watchers had introduced. His righteousness went beyond personal morality. Noah stood as a living bridge between the world that was and the world that would be. His faithfulness ensured that when the waters receded, true humanity would emerge again, uncorrupted, whole. The ark itself became a symbol of separation. For 120 years, Noah worked while the world mocked. He built a vessel of salvation while chaos reigned outside. The very act of construction declared that some things were worth preserving, that not everything had been lost to the rebellion. His 3 sons would carry this pure lineage forward: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From them, the nations would arise again. But unlike the world before, this new humanity would descend from a man who had walked faithfully with God, a man whose genealogy had been guarded through the darkest age. The Watchers had tried to corrupt God's creation beyond repair. They had nearly succeeded. But in Noah, the original seed remained, protected, waiting for the moment when the waters would wash away the defilement and allow creation to begin again. When the rains began to fall, Noah entered the ark with his family. 8 souls, the last representatives of pure humanity, the only ones who could rightfully claim descent from Adam without the taint of the Watchers' rebellion. The door sealed behind them. Outside, a world descended from corrupted unions would face judgment. Inside, the future of uncorrupted humanity waited in the darkness, trusting, hoping, preserved. The unseen war, angelic activity during the flood event. The rain began, but water was not the only force unleashed that day. Genesis describes the breaking of the fountains of the great deep and the opening of the windows of heaven. Simple words for cataclysmic events. The ancient texts, however, suggest this was more than natural disaster. This was divine warfare made manifest. The Book of Enoch hints at angelic involvement throughout the flood. The same archangels who had bound Azazel and imprisoned the Watcher leaders now turned their attention to the earth itself. Their mission was not complete. Judgment had been decreed. Now it had to be executed. Raphael had bound Azazel in the wilderness. Michael had chained the leaders of the Watchers in the valleys of the earth, but their offspring still roamed the surface. The Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones who had filled the world with violence. They, too, required judgment. The waters served as both weapon and purification. They came from above and below simultaneously. The fountains of the great deep suggest something more than rain, something from beneath the foundations of the world. The ordered boundaries that had held chaos at bay since creation were being temporarily released. Some ancient interpreters believed the archangels themselves broke open these fountains, that divine hands pulled apart the barriers holding back the primordial waters. This was not random destruction. This was surgical, precise. Every aspect of the flood served the purpose of cleansing. The Nephilim, powerful as they were, could not stand against the rising waters. The Book of Jubilees describes how even these mighty beings fell before the deluge. Their strength meant nothing when heaven and earth united in judgment. The same hybrid vigor that had made them fearsome now became their curse. Too heavy for the waters, too corrupted to deserve preservation. But other forces stirred in those 40 days. The evil spirits that would plague the post-flood world had their origin here. According to Enochic tradition, when the Nephilim perished in the waters, their spirits were released, disembodied, restless, forever wandering the earth without rest. The righteous angels worked to contain even this threat. They could not prevent these spirits from arising, but they could limit their power, bind them to certain restrictions. The Book of Jubilees tells us that 9/10 of these spirits were imprisoned. Only a tenth remained free to test humanity in the world to come. Throughout these 40 days, the ark floated on waters that covered the highest mountains. Noah and his family heard the chaos outside, the rain pounding, the waves crashing, the sounds of a world being unmade. Yet the ark never wavered, never capsized, never broke apart despite the violence of the waters around it. Ancient readers saw divine protection in this preservation. The same angelic forces that had unleashed the judgment now shielded the vessel of salvation. Uriel, the angel set over the world, and Tartarus may have been the one assigned to protect the ark. His domain included both punishment and preservation. He watched over the boundaries between the ordered and chaotic. The ark represented the ultimate boundary between those chosen for the new world and those left to the judgment of the old. The watchers, bound in their prison beneath the earth, felt the waters above. They heard the destruction of everything their rebellion had created. Their offspring were being swept away. Their forbidden knowledge was drowning with those who had practiced it. Their great work was being undone. Michael stood guard over their prison. They would not escape. They would not surface to salvage anything from the catastrophe. They had made their choice on Mount Hermon. Now they would remain in darkness until the day of final judgment. Gabriel, the angel of strength, may have aided in restraining the chaos of those 40 days. His role in divine judgment appears throughout the sacred texts. Here, his strength ensured the flood accomplished its purpose completely. No pocket of corruption could survive. No Nephilim could find refuge in caves or mountains. The waters reached everywhere. The cleansing was total. The violence that had filled the earth was being washed away. The bloodshed was being covered. The perversion of creation was being reversed. In those 40 days, the world returned to something like its state before the dry land had been separated from the waters at creation. Then came the silence. The rain stopped, the fountains closed, the windows of heaven shut. The waters began to recede, slowly revealing a cleansed earth. Empty. Ready to receive the seeds of the new world that waited in the ark. The angels had done their work. Judgment had fallen. Preservation had been maintained. Now came the time for renewal. The post-flood world, a cleansed earth, and a new angelic order. The waters drained away, the mountains appeared, the dove returned with an olive branch. Noah opened the door of the ark and stepped onto a world made new. The earth that met his eyes held no trace of the Nephilim, no remnant of the Watcher's corruption. The slate had been wiped clean by the greatest act of divine judgment the world had known. But heaven had learned from the rebellion. The old order had failed. The Watchers had been given too much freedom, too much access to humanity. A new system was needed for the nations that would arise from Noah's sons. The book of Deuteronomy preserves a curious detail that later scribes would alter. When the Most High divided the nations and separated humanity, he fixed their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. The ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, preserves this. A Dead Sea Scroll fragment and the ancient Greek Bible read sons of God, angels, rather than sons of Israel, giving rise to the idea of 70 national guardian angels. This was the new divine order. Each nation would have a guardian, a prince from among the host of heaven. But these angels would be constrained. Their role was to guide, not to descend, to watch, not to intervene directly, to maintain boundaries, not to cross them. The system represented a middle path. Humanity would not be abandoned to govern itself entirely. The chaos before the flood had proven that outcome, but neither would angels have the intimate access the Watchers had enjoyed. The memory of that catastrophe was too fresh, too terrible. These 70 princes answered to the archangels who answered to the Most High. A hierarchy was established, clear lines of authority. No angel would act alone. No single divine being could lead humanity astray as the Watchers had done. Yet even this system carried risk. The book of Daniel would later reveal that these angelic princes could become corrupted by the nations they oversaw. They could begin to identify more with their assigned peoples than with heaven's purposes. The Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece, each developing their own agenda. But in the early days after the flood, order prevailed. Noah's sons went out to repopulate the earth. Shem toward the east, Japheth toward the north and west, Ham toward the south. From them, the 70 nations would arise, each with its appointed guardian. The table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 traces these divisions. Every tribe, every tongue, every landmass was distributed according to divine plan. The new world would be organized from the beginning, structured, prevented from falling into the chaos that had preceded the flood. The boundaries mattered. When humanity later tried to unite again at Babel, building a tower to heaven, God scattered them according to the nations he had already assigned. The angelic princes helped maintain these divisions. They ensured that no single human power could rise to threaten the cosmic order as the Nephilim once had. The earth itself bore scars from the flood. The mountains had been thrust up higher, the valleys had been carved deeper, the continents had been reshaped. But these changes served a purpose. They formed natural boundaries between the nations. They prevented easy mixing that might lead to the concentrated corruption that had preceded the judgment. Noah built an altar and offered sacrifice. The smoke rose to heaven. God placed a rainbow in the clouds as a sign of covenant. Never again would all flesh be destroyed by water. The cleansing was complete. The new age had begun. The righteous angels looked upon this fresh start with hope tempered by memory. They had seen the cost of the Watchers' rebellion. They had participated in the judgment that followed. Now they would serve as guardians of a system designed to prevent such catastrophe from happening again. The Watchers remained in their prison. Azazel stayed bound in the desert. The leaders sat chained in the valleys beneath the earth. They would not be released until the day of final judgment. Their influence on humanity had been severed. Their gifts of forbidden knowledge had been drowned with those who practiced them. The world could begin again, clean, pure, protected by a heavenly order that had learned from the mistakes of the past. The 70 princes took their posts over the developing nations. The archangels maintained their oversight. The divine council functioned as it was meant to from the beginning. Humanity would still have free will. They would still face temptation and make choices. But the kind of direct corruption the Watchers had introduced would be prevented. The boundaries between heaven and earth would be maintained. The mixing of divine and human that had produced the Nephilim would not happen again. At least, not in the same way. Not in that age. The angels watched over the growing nations with vigilance born of experience. They knew what corruption looked like. They had seen where it led. They would not let it happen again. The lingering legacy, echoes of the Watchers in ancient myth and prophecy. But some things refused to stay buried. Centuries passed after the flood. Noah's descendants multiplied and filled the earth. The memory of the Watchers faded into legend. The Nephilim became stories told around fires. Yet the ancient corruption had left marks that would not vanish completely. When Moses sent spies into Canaan, they returned with a terrifying report. Giants lived in the land, the sons of Anak. Men of great stature who made the Israelite spies feel like grasshoppers. The report specifically names them. We saw the Nephilim there. This should have been impossible. The flood had destroyed all flesh. The Nephilim had perished in the waters. Their hybrid existence had been erased from the earth. Yet here they were again, or something very much like them. The Book of Numbers records this encounter without explanation. Later texts would attempt to understand it. Some ancient interpreters believed that the angelic rebellion had happened again after the flood on a smaller scale. A much later medieval legend toys with the idea that one of the wives carried corrupted blood, but no ancient source suggests this. Still others propose that the term Nephilim had simply come to mean any giants, even those of purely human descent. But the pattern was undeniable. In Canaan, in the lands God had promised to Abraham's descendants, the old corruption had taken root again. The cities of the Anakim stood as fortresses, their warriors terrified even seasoned soldiers. The land itself seemed cursed by their presence. God's command to Israel was absolute. The people of Canaan were to be driven out completely. No treaties, no compromise. The command seemed harsh to later readers, but ancient Israel understood it in context. This was not mere conquest. This was the completion of the judgment that had begun at the flood. The Anakim fell before Israel's armies, slowly over generations. Og of Bashan, the giant king, was defeated. His bed of iron measured 13 feet long. The valley of Rephaim, named for these ancient giants, was cleared. The sons of Anak were pushed to the edges of the land and beyond, yet even then some survived. Goliath of Gath stood 9 feet tall and challenged Israel's armies. His brothers, giants all alike, served in the Philistine forces. The legacy of the pre-flood corruption persisted in pockets, in hidden places, like a disease that refuses to be fully cured. The ancient myths remembered too. Every culture that descended from Noah's sons carried stories of the time before. The Greeks spoke of titans who had mated with humans to produce heroes. The Sumerians told of the Anunnaki who had come down from heaven. The Hindu texts described the Asuras who had brought knowledge to mankind. Different names, different details, but the same basic story. These were not random inventions. They were cultural memories of the Watchers. Distorted through time and retelling, mixed with local details and theological frameworks, but rooted in the same historical events. The rebellion had been so catastrophic that every branch of humanity carried the tale forward. The prophetic texts looked beyond even these historical echoes. They spoke of a final return, a last rebellion, a time when the imprisoned angels would be released for judgment. The Apostle Peter would later write of angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, held in chains of darkness until judgment. Jude would reference the angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and were kept in eternal chains. The book of Revelation would describe a final loosing of bound powers in the last days. These were not abstract theological concepts. They pointed back to the Watchers, to the rebellion that had brought the flood, to the judgment that had bound them in darkness beneath the earth. And they pointed forward to a day when those bonds would break, and the ancient prisoners would face their final reckoning. The Enochic texts describe this final judgment in vivid detail. The Watchers would be brought from their prison. They would see the destruction of everything they had worked to create. They would face the full consequence of their rebellion, not just imprisonment, but ultimate separation from the divine presence they had abandoned. Their offspring, the disembodied spirits that had haunted humanity since the flood, would also face judgment. The demons that had tested and tempted humanity through the ages would be bound. The connection between the pre-flood rebellion and the present spiritual warfare would be made clear. In this way, the story of the angels and the flood never truly ended. It continued through history. It echoed in the giants of Canaan. It whispered in the myths of every nation. It promised a final resolution in the age to come. The righteous angels maintained their watch. The 70 princes guarded their nations with varying degrees of faithfulness. The archangels stood ready to act again when the moment came. Heaven had not forgotten the rebellion. Earth carried its scars, and the future held a day when all accounts would be settled. Noah's descendants spread across the world, unaware of how much their survival had mattered. They were the clean slate, the preserved seed, the proof that God's image in humanity could not be permanently corrupted. Every child born of their line was a victory over the Watchers' attempt to make humanity something other than what God intended. The story of the angels and the flood lives on because it speaks to something deeper than ancient history. It reminds us that the world we see is not the whole picture, that forces beyond our vision shape events we live through, that rebellion has consequences that echo through generations, and that judgment, though sometimes delayed, is never forgotten. The Watchers learned this. The Nephilim learned this. The giants of Canaan learned this. And the final generation, according to prophecy, will learn it again when the ancient prisoners are released and the cycle reaches its conclusion at last.